So I'd say this is oh, thank you. This is the biggest screen I've ever lectured to. It's kind of daunting. Just I wanted to say, first of all, thanks to John and to the Harner Prize for inviting me down for this lecture. I'm really honored and pleased to be here to talk a bit about the work of our office. One thing that I have to do tonight is, at the risk of being overly academic, but we are in an academic context, to frame the work of our office, LTL Architects, in the context of questions of section that we've been investigating, both professionally but also academically. My partners, David and Paul Lewis, are also teachers. We all kind of run an office that's based on being in part academic and in part based in the realities of day-to-day practice. Our work is broad in its context and typology. We work on everything from ground-up buildings to speculative proposals for urban sites. This is a project that we did for the Museum of Modern Art exhibition entitled Rising Currents, which was one of the first exhibitions to examine the questions of rising sea levels impacts in urban contexts, to even operating in the context of site-specific installations, an installation at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Research Center in Manhattan. And in the context of all of this work, however, we operate in a somewhat, let's say, consistent methodological way. And we talk about a number of principles that we use to organize our design process. And the first of these is this question of catalyzing constraints, which essentially means that we try to avoid coming to any project with a preconceived notion of a design that's executed as a kind of aesthetic imposition from outside, but rather begin each of our projects with an in-depth examination of what we call the givens. What are the constraints? What are the limits? What are the parameters and opportunities? And use a thorough understanding of those, let's say, parameters and guidelines, those constraints, and even things that might be conceived of as restrictions on creativity or invention to drive the design trajectory. This leads to what we talk about as multivalent performance, which means very simply that we like everything in the project to do more than one thing. So a window can become a projection screen for urban, say, spectacle. An awning can become an entryway, et cetera, et cetera. This relates very closely to these questions of resourcefulness. And we think of resourcefulness broadly, that on the one hand, it means that it's the architect's responsibility to work in the most optimistic and opportunistic way with the ecological, economic, and material resources that are available, and to do, in a way, more with less, right? So how can we actually take advantage of everything at hand to create the greatest impact? Super critical for ourselves as architects, but also as teachers, is this question of social intensification, and particularly in a world where all of our lives are increasingly dominated by virtual social networks. We feel very strongly that architect has a critical and unique role of fostering collectivity and community in space, right? That it does that better than anything else. And it does that in a kind of political and social context where we're sorely lacking that kind of connectivity in our day-to-day physical lives. And then the last is this notion of productive paradox. And what we mean by that is that rather than striving towards an easy synthesis of all of the aspects of the work into some kind of seamless whole, we actually enjoy and attempt to exploit the internal contradictions that inherently evolve in any sophisticated or complex architectural project. And I would say here that even a very small, apparently simple architectural project is inherently complex. So how can we actually, in some cases, magnify those questions, those paradoxes, to create kind of productive effects? However, although that really kind of talks to our kind of broader strategic mentality, we've also become, in the last few years, very interested in questions of section, architectural section, and we recently put out a publication called Manual of Section. We worked for about over 4 years on the project, really with no kind of outside financial support, just because we were all really kind of interested and compelled by these questions of section in architecture. We were also struck when we began to research it that there's an absolute dearth of let's say, theoretical, historiographic, or conceptual thought about sections. So whereas we all know there are reams and reams of publications about types of plans and the historical organization and evolution of plans, there's almost no corresponding work on section. And this is the way that the section is usually thought of in practice, right? That it's a kind of retroactive and retrospective document to codify and delineate the relationships between systems, between structures, mechanical systems, membrane systems, and to allow those to be constructed in the most effective way. However, what we're really interested in terms of section is its simultaneous capacity to talk on the one hand about that kind of technical precision, but simultaneously to also talk about the perceptual, experiential, and subjective aspects of architecture, to combine in a way in one drawing type, and we often experiment with actually combining section with perspective, so you'll be seeing a lot of sectional perspectives probably tonight, but to simultaneously allow an apprehension of the building both as a spatial and material construct and as a social and, let's say, perceived reality. A kind of dialogue between the sensible and the intelligible. And in this sense, what we're really interested in is not just the walls, floors, and ceilings, the roofs that comprise a building or a series of spaces, but how those create human inhabitation, human action, circulation, movement, flow, and various forms of subjectivity. So one of the fascinating things about section, I'll move through this part very quickly, the sort of history part, and get to some projects very soon. But what really struck us is that section is actually a very latecomer to architectural history. Although there are extant examples of sectional drawings as early as the 13th century, it really isn't until the Italian Renaissance that you start to see section being deployed as a kind of integral part of architectural thinking and practice. And in fact, where it actually begins as a kind of retrospective document. So the earliest examples of drawings that we could think of as section are actually recordings of archaeological ruins and correspond to the kind of enthusiasm of the time of architects in Europe for classical antiquity. So they were observing ruins. They were observing the physical ruptures and breaks in structures. And only later did those actual breaks, did those actual fractures in buildings start to transform into a way of thinking about a cut through a building as a representational technique to understand a complete building. So the Pantheon, which was actually an extremely kind of common and popular subject of these kinds of drawings, was a complete building. It was an extant building that was intact. And gradually the technique began to evolve to deploy this idea of a cut, idea of a kind of conceptual cut through the building, a slice through the building as a way of understanding that building, and only later as a means of projecting design. So it's only in the kind of later 1500s with Palladio, then ultimately with the kind of French Academy, where we see section becoming integrated into the sort of triumvirate of orthographic projection, plan, section, and elevation that we all kind of think of today as sort of integral to our understanding of architecture. As buildings became increasingly complex through the 18th and 19th centuries, section became really the preeminent way of understanding the complex interaction between spaces, infrastructural systems, and even our kind of metropolitan context. So the complexity of the relationship between, let's say, domestic interior space and the infrastructure of a sewer system is only really revealed through the conceptual cut of the section. So the section makes visible the invisible. It reveals the hidden connections between things that on the surface might seem autonomous and disconnected. And by the time we get to the 20th century, we have section as really the only way of understanding and conceptualizing the vertical stratification of the contemporary metropolis as a kind of a layered system of vehicles, pedestrians, technologies, and then ultimately buildings. On the other hand, in architecture, we have complete transformation around the same time with the invention of the domino system, Corbusier's Maison Domino, which is, as we all know famously from our architectural history courses, the idea of this sort of stacking of floor plates with a point structure system that allows for the kind of continuous replication of a certain territory in plan. That's radically different from pre-modern architectures where, let's say, the static and structural forces of a dome would translate into the masonry bearing wall conditions of the plan. So what we have in essence is the kind of emergence of free plan at the top, where the plan can vary radically from floor to floor, but at the absence or at the neutralization of the section. right? So the section becomes relegated to the ad nauseum repetition of self-similar floor plates. And this aligns perfectly with the advent of the Chicago frame and constructional systems based on steel fabrication, with the kind of economic logics of exploiting kind of limited plots of urban land. So all of these things start to conspire, in a sense, to neutralize architectural section into a kind of, kind of hegemony of the stacked floor plate. So this method of making buildings, which is simply stacking one floor over the next, becomes really the predominant method of making space in the 20th century. And that leads to, on the one hand, a kind of spectacle when taken to an extreme, but also a kind of loss of what we feel is the kind of let's say, performative, speculative, and projective aspect of section to visualize new possibilities. So the Manual of Section book actually thinks about the idea of section, and I'm going to probably go pretty rapidly through these images versus the photographs of projects because they don't actually show up terribly well on the screen. There's books out there that you can look at, and they show up better there. But the book comprises 63 sectional perspectives of drawings from the 20th century. And what we really are arguing in the book is that this proliferation of invention, of new ways of thinking about section, of new ways of manipulating the three-dimensional form of buildings, the vertical aspect of buildings, really emerges as a kind of resistance to and as a kind of counterposition to this kind of dominance of the stacked floor plate that comes to really kind of represent the kind of vast majority of building in contemporary times. And we begin to look at this from a kind of taxonomic viewpoint where we categorize types of section according to these sort of 7 categories: extrusion, stack, shear, hole, incline, nest, and then hybrids, which isn't really a typology, but in a way represents the fact that all of these really typically combine in different buildings. Extrusion, and what I'm going to do tonight, in case it's baffling, is to try to use these sectional ideas to talk about some of the ways that we're looking at these same issues in our projects. Extrusion is, of course, you all probably know, it's what you get criticized for as a first-year architecture student, which is just taking your plan and then extruding it up to the height required. And so in that sense, it's the most banal form of section, the least inventive, and the least interesting. However, it actually has the capacity to generate interesting effects. So when used at the kind of domestic scale of a house, for example, in connection to, let's say, extensive glazing and strategic positioning of structure, it can create a kind of horizontal relationship to the landscape. So here, section, which is usually about the vertical, being kind of organized to create a horizontal relationship. Or when taken to a kind of extreme in scale in Nervi's Palace of Labor, 65-foot mushroom columns supporting 155-foot square tabletop roofs, which create a kind of urban spectacle out of extrusion. So that leads me to the first of the projects that I'm going to talk about tonight, where we were really struggling with this question of extrusion and how you can take a single-story structure that in fact has to be flat, has to be sectionally very restrained, and actually create an architectural response to that. And the building is the Helen Walton Children's Enrichment Center. It's an early childhood education center in Bentonville, Arkansas. Yes, those Waltons. And this is a kind of recent model photograph of the project. The project is located between downtown Bentonville and adjacent to Crystal Bridges. The site is a kind of greenfield site. And the section of the project is super dumb. It's really basically just a double-loaded corridor bar with classrooms on either side. Those classrooms front on exterior porches, and there's a central corridor. Nothing terribly interesting about that. But what we did was to take 4 of those classroom bars and basically rotate them around a continuous center, a kind of a hub, creating this kind of spoke configuration. So that each of those classrooms would have a kind of direct relationship both to a more intimately scaled circulation space, but also to an exterior space. And then we nested within each of those classrooms a kind of, let's say, child's version of an abstracted notion of a house, which would, on the one hand, articulate the corridor through a series of niches and entryways, but also link each of the classrooms, importantly, to 3 differentially scaled exterior play spaces, which were carefully designed and calibrated to address the needs of the children who are here, who are very young children, very small children. Let's say the pedagogy or the ideology is that all of these children engage with the outside, with the playscape every day, kind of rain or shine, all year round. So this idea was that the building, in its simplicity of section, would actually, again, create this kind of continuous relationship between inside and outside. And we're working with landscape architects to design these playscapes based on indigenous fauna, or flora rather, as well as kind of age-appropriate slopes and transformations of the ground. Again, each of those classrooms is kind of consolidated around a central core, and then the entirety of those playscapes is ringed by what is essentially a fence. But the trick here was, how could we make a fence that isn't a fence? And so we developed a system of these basically cantilevered vertical timbers, which would construct a kind of perimeter, which would define the play spaces, enclose them in part, and then create the kind of security that was required without creating, hopefully, what would feel like a kind of walled compound. Those vertical elements kind of consolidate and inflect inward at the entryway, and then they spill out to create a kind of disseminated field that acts as a kind of entry grove to the space with benches and lighting and spaces for gathering. The plan itself is, and we realized this at some point through the process, essentially a kind of panopticon, right? So spaces like this are often organized in this way, a kind of central point of control. However, as you'll see if you look at the plan, it's a kind of intentionally imperfect panopticon. So there's no single kind of circle, there's no single circumference that rules. And you see all the lines crossing in the center in this diagram mean that there is no controlling point of surveillance. And so it was very important for us to, in a way, kind of take back the kind of prison, as it were, kind of take back this kind of system of control and give it over to the inmates, in this case the children, who would kind of get the center space, a kind of collective play space with kind of interactive playrooms that could open, kind of create a kind of active hub where there was no central locus point, no central point of control. The project is now under construction. That's that central space now. Those oculi are looking a little bit terrifying right now, I admit, but will be better when there's daylight coming through. This is one of the classrooms that I was indicating before, with the sort of internal felt-lined surface of the kind of abstracted house. And that's the kind of in-construction photograph of the building in its site, where we start to see the integration of the landscape and the playscapes around the building. So moving on to the second category of section, stack. Stack is pretty easy. It's basically just putting one extruded section on top of another. Probably the most famous example of this for kind of architect nerds maybe is the Downtown Athletic Club in Manhattan that Kohlhaas famously talks about in Delirious, New York, where you actually take the homogeneous stack and start to differentiate it. So each of the floors is actually defined in its sectional height by the requirements of the athletic activity that's going on. So you have billiards, squash courts, miniature golf, a kind of gymnasium, swimming pool, all of which have different floor-to-floor heights and generate internally a kind of complex section. You have this stacked landscape, MVRDV's Hanover Pavilion. You have stacking as a way of integrating and let's say choreographing the mechanical complexities of complex modern buildings like Kahn's Salk Lab, and you have stacking as a way of creating urban space in the case of Lino Bobardi's kind of Museum of Art in Sao Paulo. We engaged a project, not going through those quickly, but hopefully you'll have a chance to look at those drawings in greater detail. We had a chance recently in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy to basically rebuild the iconic steeplechase pier in New York City in Coney Island. That's the pier there. It is essentially one enormous extruded plane. It's 300 yards long approximately, and it was originally a landing terminal for ferries that came from Manhattan, which that use is not kind of relevant anymore. The pier was damaged during Sandy. Basically the entire kind of wooden top slid off under the force of the storm, And this, by the way, is the section of the pier. So it's, extremely long and extremely flat, so kind of inherently uninteresting. But it is a stack, so it does kind of create a relationship to the water and the beach below. It creates a kind of exchange, and here you see a drawing that's really talking about the structural reinforcing that we did in combination with our kind of engineers to create a new pier that would be resistant to kind of future storms with a kind of sacrificial deck, but a kind of robust understructure that would resist most of the hurricane forces that are predicted. On the top, however, we really tried to exploit this just extremity of length. So you have this kind of enormously long pier. We weren't able to alter the footprint, but we began to sort of think about the different ways that this creates an urban spectacle. We designed benches, these kind of push-me-pull-you benches that look both out to the water and inward towards the pier for people watching. We created this kind of wave-like bench, which becomes a space of public lounging and, of course, skateboarding. We created these, again, custom benches and railings, and then this sort of biplane-like kind of canopy at the kind of crossing of the pier. That was a kind of custom construction of steel and aluminum, which would cast shadows of Coney Island onto the surface of the deck through a series of welded aluminum tabs, as well as create the visual advertisement of Coney Island to passing planes approaching the local airports. At the end is what we would call an incline, which I'll talk about later, which is just a ramp that allows for a kind of unimpeded appreciation of the horizon of the ocean, looking over the heads of the local fishermen who are here basically all year round, kind of using the end of the pier, so trying to allow for both kind of promenading, visual spectacle, and all of these kinds of local uses to happen simultaneously, and really understanding this as a space that purely in its breadth and scale would create a kind of spectacle. And then we worked extensively with the Department of Parks to place these benches precisely the necessary distance away from the railings so that nobody would do this. And this is, of course, what happens in New York City is that that parkour guys get out there and realize that they can, in fact, pole vault from the benches over the railing onto the beach, all the while somehow, and if you can make it out, wearing a gorilla mask. But, so the third of these categories is shape. Shape, and I realize these don't show up great here, which is why I'm going through them quickly. Shape is what it sounds like. It's the deformation of one of the primary horizontal surfaces of the building in order to create effects, spatial, acoustical, lighting effects, and often structural correspondences. So for example, in Utzons Bagsværd Church in Copenhagen, these undulating concrete shells, which actually act as spanning beams across the 63 feet of the nave, create surfaces that allow for the leakage and deployment of sunlight into the church, and also kind of accentuate this kind of upward vaulting at the altar. So this idea, which is actually common to pre-modern masonry architectures, of how structural forces, architectural expression, and collectivity are actually synthesized within a single formal system, and then the ways that that's been taken to kind of, let's say, morphological extremes by contemporary architects, like Ito in the Taichung Opera House. We have experimented with this question of shape in a number of recent projects. This is a project that we completed a few years back at the Claremont University Consortium, Claremont Colleges in California, just outside of LA. We were asked to create a new administrative center for the consortium, which is the administrative wing of the colleges. And we were given as site this building, which is a prefabricated steel shed that formerly served as the facilities home, the maintenance home for services. So as you can imagine, it was a little bit of a hard sell to tell everybody on campus that was already working in this context that they were going to be now working in a maintenance building, which was kind of south of the train tracks, or just adjacent to the train tracks that terminate campus. The building was a football field long again, a very long building, a kind of open steel, prefabricated building, with a number of kind of mechanical installations interrupting this great volume of space, but it did have a kind of fantastic sectional quality. It had this kind of great volume of space to kind of operate with, and then this unimpeded large floor plate. But on the other hand, we now had to make this inhabitable, It was a non-conditioned space. We had to make it conditioned. We had to introduce daylighting. We had to introduce all of these other mechanical systems that you see in this slide. And so how could we do that without basically, again, canceling out the quality of the space, what was great about it, which was this sort of pitched roof interior ceiling. The normative response would, of course, to be just put a dropped acoustical ceiling grid there. But what we did was to develop a series of custom fabricated acoustical foam recycled plastic fins, which could be deployed and hung from the existing superstructure of the prefabricated steel shell. And then like a marionette, they were jointed so that each one could be subtly manipulated to create a kind of continuous shaped form, which would begin to sort of define the interior space of this extremely long football field length building, to billow upward over collective spaces like this bleacher seating that was built over an electrical transformer, or to define space, again, defining spaces of gathering and collectivity, and create spaces as well of repose, meeting, of kind of workspaces within the same context. The exterior of the building looked like this. This is before renovation, this is what we did. And so we also had to make that appealing on a very tight and economic budget. And so what we did was to propose a 600-foot-long cedar fence, in essence, that would wrap the existing kind of undistinguished, let's say, architectural exterior with a continuous screen, which would map to the profile and geometry of the building in large part, but then strategically pull away to create spaces of exterior-interior overlap to produce terraces, porches, the kind of shaded spaces that are actually extremely wonderful in a climate like Southern California, or here probably. And this kind of lattice would begin to sort of shift from a face to a canopy, create a kind of condition at the entryway, and then through the integration of a series of linear LED strips, this fence also becomes the site lighting and the building lighting simultaneously, allowing the building to act as a kind of a beacon at the edge of campus and attract traffic at night, and then folding over at the entryway to create a bench and to define the main public entry to this new administrative and kind of conference center. Another example of shape, a more recent and smaller project, we were asked to look at a lecture hall at what's called Pulitzer Hall at Columbia University. And this is part of the School of Journalism. And it is literally, this space is literally where they announce the Pulitzer Prizes. Believe it or not, with the bad yellow carpet and the drop ceiling. We were given the charge to transform the space, but without touching any of the mechanical systems, without touching any of the infrastructure of the lighting, any of the other kinds of conditions. And then like most academic spaces, we were also asked to do that in a way that this space could do anything. It could be a classroom, it could be a lecture hall, it could be a performance space, et cetera, et cetera. So what we did was to begin to think again about shaping the section. So what you see in the sectional diagram are the existing massive ducts that feed this space, which we were not allowed to touch because it would have triggered a level of building department review that they didn't want to deal with. And then this system, which really is a kind of custom acoustical ceiling tile that we developed with the fabricator in Brooklyn, developing a kind of a geometry and a morphology that would allow us to do a couple of things. One would be to accommodate all that ductwork lighting and infrastructure, but on the other hand, as the blue dotted line showed, to open up the ceiling to allow for the perception of the original McKim-Mead white windows, these kinds of spectacular arched transom windows. This is a kind of diagram showing that system. There were, I think, 20 different ceiling tile geometries or types. They range from what we started calling innies or outies, because they stuck either up or down, and they refer to the kind of coffered architecture of the existing McKim-Mead white building, which has this kind of coffered articulation in most of the public spaces. And that's a view of the kind of finished project. The ceiling was actually built off-site. Each of these sort of conical sections was built off-site, again, out of the same recycled acoustical foam felt that we were referring to earlier. The center of each of the coffers includes lighting. that is adjustable. They inflect upward at the front to create views. They inflect downward at the back of the space to integrate a large-scale projector for documentary films, as well as existing diffusers, ductwork, and to create this kind of acoustical baffle to reflect space back to the front. Because the space was intended to be multifunctional, we developed a moving wall called the breathing wall, which basically would allow for storage of the chairs when there was a large event, and for the transformation of the space into multiple configurations, from kind of thrust stage to symposium to classroom breakout. And then each of these kind of custom conical elements would both house its own lighting, but also integrate lighting in between to create this kind of sculpted effect, a kind of, in a way, intensified reflected ceiling plan that really becomes the image of the space without impeding the articulation or the programmatic flexibility of the floor plate. Moving on to shear. There are two categories of shear that we identify in the book. There's horizontal shear and there's vertical shear, and what it means very simply is a kind of shift in either the vertical or horizontal axis of a series of stacked floor plates. Big mountain housing, the way that each of the floors of this begin to stagger back to create a series of terraces and solar exposure above and a kind of parking garage below. I won't go through each of these individually, but hopefully you start to get the idea of how this allows for the production of optical, acoustical, spatial, and also performative continuities between what would otherwise be discontinuous spaces separated by floor plates, right? So as I slide one floor plate back relative to another, it creates a relationship. So, for example, in 13 Rue Amaro, the Parisian housing project by Henri Sauvage, we start to see how the sort of staggering back or the shearing back of each of the apartment units creates a double effect, a series of balconies and terraces to capitalize on solar exposure on the exterior, but then this underbelly effect, which is capitalized on by generating a public space for a swimming pool for the building on the interior. Vertical shear is just the opposite. It's beginning to kind of shift, as in Herzberger's Apollo School, the levels of floors on either side, again, to create a kind of a sort of new set of relationships. So at Diller's Video and Renfro's Granov Center at Brown University, you can see how the staggering of the floor plates actually allows for visual interaction between acoustically discontinuous spaces, right? So if you line those floor plates up straight across, none of those spaces only have a relationship to one space. If you break that floor plate and shift it, you now have multiplied the relationships exponentially. This was a struggle. We don't have that many shear projects, but we one kind of our limited number of residential projects that we worked on, we realized actually was a shear project by accident. So we were asked to renovate two sides of an existing New York City townhouse. As you can see, hopefully in this diagram, which is a little kind of low on resolution, the two sides of the house were actually curiously built with different floor plate alignments. So we had this really interesting conundrum where we had to create one continuous space out of a series of misaligned floor levels. And so our solution to this was, rather than trying to hide it or obfuscate it or kind of blend it away, was to kind of accentuate it by the introduction of a new public staircase that would allow for vertical linkages between each of these staggered floors. There were, I think, 7 different floor levels in what was ostensibly a 3-story building, creating circulational continuity between spaces, but still allowing for optical links. And we did this also by introducing a vertical screen of blackened steel and walnut that would create a kind of translucent or kind of permeable boundary that would link all 3 floors from the kind of lower level to the upper levels, while at the same time allowing for glimpses and kind of visual continuities between the 2 sides of the house along the kind of north-south axis. Hole is actually probably one of the most commonly used and recognizable ways of manipulating an architectural section, and it is simply that. Buildings are full of holes, vertical holes, for shaftways, staircases, elevators, mechanical systems, and the like. But they're often obviously deployed in kind of architectural terms and really kind of encompass everything from the double height spaces of, let's say, Corbusier's house at the Waisenhofsiedlung, to the atrium of Wright's Larkin building or the Ford Foundation, to the kind of multi-story urban spectacle of a Portman hotel lobby. The notion of a whole is obviously that it allows within the composition of stacked floor plates the kinds of visual and spatial continuities that we've been discussing, but it also allows for the transaction of both vertical movement as well as infrastructural systems. So obviously and famously at Ito's Sendai Mediatek, the holes become a column, the column becomes a conduit for movement and other technical systems to make their way through the building, and the overall kind of composition of stacked floors is rendered kind of perforated and porous in the vertical dimension itself. So this project is a project that deploys holes in a number of different ways. It's a project for a Contemporary Arts Center in Austin, Texas. It was originally called the Contemporary. It's now melded with or conjoined with the Austin Museum of Art. We renovated in 2 phases, and as I was alluding to at the beginning of the lecture, we were really interested in this idea of how the design could proceed from research. So the first thing we did was to look at the history of the building, and we kind of mapped out a sort of timeline of the evolution of this existing structure. So it began life as originally a kind of proscenium theater around the 20th century. At around 1950, it was transformed into a learner's department store. At that point, what had been a single-story space was cut in half horizontally through the insertion of a new concrete floor plate and the introduction of a kind of a large-scale window. This meant that actually the art center, art house, the Contemporary, was not able to use that upper level because it was not egressable. So what we did was to really look at this historical accumulation of layers within the building and think about it as a kind of Russian nesting doll of both structural systems of architectural realities that we wanted to take advantage of to kind of exploit and reveal rather than to kind of conceal or paper over. So we really thought about our own architectural interventions as tactical additions, which would augment the programmatic performativity of the building, while at the same time actually adding a new layer that doesn't overwrite or erase the older layers. One aspect of this was this south-facing wall. Department stores and theaters actually famously don't want much interface with the exterior, right? You don't want windows, you don't want a lot of natural daylighting. Ironically, contemporary art centers don't really either, because curators like to control the amount of light, but at the same time we wanted to kind of introduce a kind of public porosity of the building to make it part of the city. So what we did was to introduce a series of apertures, of holes at a smaller scale. There are 146 custom laminated glass blocks that kind of perforate the southern facade of the building. They're flush with the surface of the building at the street level to discourage rock climbing, and then they kind of stick further out as you kind of move your way up the building, and they cast shadows and introduce diffuse light onto the interior. This is an interior shot of the lobby, and this idea of hole really comes into play in this new public staircase that we introduced to link the upper level of the main, what would be the main gallery, to the lower level of the lobby that connects to the sidewalk in the street. So the staircase does a couple of things. It takes the concrete articulation of the lobby, which we saw as related to the sidewalk, and then thinks about the stair in 2 parts as a series of these heavy concrete planes built up from the floor, and then a series of lighter weight wooden elements that are essentially dropping down from the ceiling. Those lighter weight wooden elements actually transform into the reception desk. The stair is simultaneously kind of monumental and public, but at the same time kind of playful and not kind of single use, this idea of multivalent performance again. And it is essentially a new hole carved through the mass of the building that links the lower level to the upper level gallery, and then ultimately to the roof deck in the form of a skylight. And the articulation of the stair is based on a series of custom laminated timber members, ipe wood, laminated together into a series of treads that then extend into a series of vertical beams that were constructed off-site and then hauled and manipulated into place You can see that guy's a little worried about whether he can work out there. And the geometry of the stair is actually based on the geometry of the nosing of the tread, so that the angle of those beams actually derives from the detail of the nosing of the tread, and the stair both widens in plan and expands in section as you move from the lower level to the upper level galleries. And you can see the effect of that here from a couple of different perspectives, looking up into the kind of extension of that to the lobby, or rather to the skylight that occurs at the rooftop level. Another form of hole that we introduced here was a kind of mechanical lift. Museums need the capacity to introduce large-scale art pieces. A contemporary art gallery does in any case. So we conceal this mechanical platform that could activate and reach the upper level gallery. And then at the terrace or roof level, we basically transformed the previously uninhabited roof into an event space for outdoor gatherings, for film screens for our art installations, etc. And that was very successful for a while, except that we realized later on that one issue we hadn't considered was that Austin is very hot, and there's a lot of sunlight, so it was very successful at night, but it was problematic in the day, and the museum wanted to get greater use from it. So we were asked to do a second stage of renovations in this case, which really included roofing that roof deck. And so we worked to basically create what is a kind of extruded stack section. So a single plane, aluminum plane, that would be minimally detailed and perceptually as thin as possible, hovering above that roof deck and integrating a large-scale three-dimensional artwork that was kind of acquired for this very purpose. We were really satisfied to see how both the artwork and the museum itself made the building a kind of landmark, kind of gathering point for things like the Women's March, and how it becomes a kind of beacon at night when kind of illuminated, very close to the state capitol. That upper level roof deck now becomes a kind of covered space, and we developed a system of extraordinarily tall curtains, basically, that would allow for a kind of mitigation of weather and rain. It could be pulled around or opened up to expose or enclose the space to create connections to the city, and you can start to see how the reflective back of the art installation creates this kind of interesting visual relationship to the buildings around it. And the way that this is used is basically for really good parties. Year-round. I guess this must have been Christmas based on the Santa hat the bartender's wearing, but it really is an active space all year round, and again, kind of very pleasurable to sort of see how this becomes both an integral part of the city, but also the life of the institution. Incline. So incline is very simple. It's basically a ramp. It's basically taking the horizontal condition of the floor and transitioning it into the diagonal to create continuities between floor levels, links circulationally and visually. And that can range from everything like the more, let's say, limited ramp promenade, the architectural promenade of the Villa Savoy, to the continuous Archimedean spiral of the Guggenheim Museum that really comprises the totality of the principal architectural condition, to the various manifestations and manipulations of the oblique surface by Homais and Rem Koolhaas, which we're all probably quite familiar with in our own work. In 2004, we were commissioned by Architectural Record to be part of the Venice Biennale, and we were asked to look, along with 5 other architects, at what were considered to be a series of prototypically American building types, and we were given the parking garage, yay, I guess. And we became fascinated by this conventional, very kind of recognizable sloped switchback floor plate, right? This sort of simple diagram that is actually kind of a sort of super common typology for parking garages. But then we started to think about the emerging technologies at the time of electric cars and how an elimination of the negative kind of toxic environmental impacts of cars could allow for a closer relationship between program and parking. So what we did was to essentially pull open that spiral section and to insert a layer of program to generate what was essentially a 77-story drive-up skyscraper, where a continuous drive-through parking garage was intertwined in the manner of a kind of DNA double helix with a continuous sandwich of inhabitable programmatic space. That program varied from retail at the bottom to hotel and office in the middle to housing at the top, and basically created a series of vertically distributed neighborhoods, each of which operated with the kind of legislated proportional relationships between parking requirements and program requirements to develop the spatial diagram. So we looked, for example, at the retail levels as both the continuation of the urban street, but also a kind of strange mutation of the suburban typology of the strip shopping center where every parking space was a good one, but we could also generate this kind of vertical urban density. The hotel became a kind of mutant, let's say, love child of suburban motel with an urban atrium hotel typology, where a series of alternating bands of rooms and parking would surround and define a multi-story atrium, which would have both a series of public programmatic spaces, including an elevated swimming pool, but also an express ramp for the electrical vehicles as they move to the top of the building, and then finally at the top of the tower, a vertical, basically a vertical neighborhood of cantilevered houses, which would combine the pleasures of suburban life, lawns and lawn furniture, with the kind of, let's say, seduction of vertical suburban life, where the kind of tedium of the horizontal commute would be basically replaced by the seduction of the vertical ascent. So rather than driving to work every day on the highway, you could basically drive up and down your tower to and from work with kind of panoramic mountain view stops along the way. So the last, I promise, of these types is nest. Nest is very different from the other types because it doesn't necessarily depend upon this notion of stacked floor plates and a reaction to those stacked floor plates. It's really about the volumetric nesting, as the name suggests, of spatial bodies within one another. So again, the Russian nesting doll comes to mind, and Fujimoto's house in Tokyo is a very explicit example of that, where you have a series of envelopes, one within the other, that define layers of privacy and environmental enclosure. And in fact, Charles Moore's house in Orinda, California, also creates spaces within spaces that, within a very diminutive, modestly scaled building, create a kind of hierarchy of kind of oscillating openness and kind of implied closure. Herzog and Demeron's Prada Aoyama exploits this both for structural and programmatic effect. The Beinecke Library in Yale famously utilizes the nesting section to mitigate light, to create effects of luminosity, while protecting in the interior volume the kind of cache of historical archival books, the rare books at the center of the building. And the nesting is also utilized often for thermal effects. So at Jourda's Herrensaddingen kind of training center, you essentially have a large-scale greenhouse, a massive greenhouse, in which are a series of more normative or conventional buildings, which now only have to respond to the thermal demands of a much more mild and buffered climate. So these are the kind of last few projects I'm going to be talking about, and they're all either recently completed or actually, in the case of the next two, still on the boards. They're both art museums of sorts, and therefore they both have a lot of demands relative to the environmental control of the space. So in other words, if you're showing works on paper, if you're showing paintings, you need to guarantee certain levels of humidity and temperature. You have to kind of mitigate fluctuations in climate, etc. And we were asked by basically a new organization called Poster House to design for them a new museum of posters, apparently the first museum of posters in the United States to be located in this space on 23rd Street in New York City. This is the space as it existed. It's kind of a great space. It's basically one big kind of double height open volume, and it extends 250 feet from 23rd Street on the south to 24th Street on the north. But we had a challenge, which was, this is an old turn-of-the-century building. It's leaky from a kind of thermal standpoint, environmental standpoint, and we had to kind of create this controlled environment. So we really started to think about the project as a building within the building, a ship in the bottle, where we would basically have an enclosed and controllable environment for the work within this kind of existing shell, and then we could reveal the kind of, in a way, the almost found urban ruin of that shell as a kind of extension of the street. maintaining kind of movement through the space from north to south. Model studies that kind of looked at the deployment of that volume, how it kind of would occur within the space. And then this is the kind of plan, kind of sequence, looking at that long through-block space, streets at either narrow end, and then long party walls on the sides, which don't really allow for natural light or ventilation. The division of that space into a public side and a gallery side, so an environmentally controlled side and an open side. The inflection of that 200-foot-long line, this kind of line of division through the space diagonally, so that it created more space at the front for the public and more space in the rear for the gallery. And then the kind of manipulation of that form to create a relationship between a kind of public through street, which would house the collective programs, and the controlled space of the gallery. And then a kind of articulated millwork, a kind of continuous piece of urban scale cabinetry, a sort of street furniture, which would allow for all of the programs to emerge. That same kind of logic in 3 dimensions, seeing how the gallery side is really conceived of as a volume, as an object, as a mass, where we could sort of carve into that space to generate enclosure, to generate a kind of dialogue between inside and outside within a building. So you go inside into an outside, that's an inside of an outside, to go into another inside, which is inside and inside. That's the kind of 2 parts of the building. And then we began to think about basically the facade as a series of frames from the street that would allow kind of views of exhibitions that could be curated on the outside on one side, a kind of photo booth where you can superpose yourself into popular posters, apparently. See how that works. And then this shows basically a series of cuts moving through the longitudinal axis of the space. And the idea here was to really think about this 200-foot long diagonal wall as a way of manipulating the spatial conditions, so that as you move through, you shift from the public side, that's a kind of exterior, to the interior of the gallery. And so we can, within a single spatial proposition, create continuity, treating this as really a kind of a linear street, a kind of internalized street that links 23rd to 24th Street, as well as linking a series of public programs, a series of views through the space showing the integration of the artwork, and then this kind of split screen effect where you see simultaneously into the gallery, the controlled space, and then into the kind of open space of the building shell. The gallery contains a 40-foot long rotating wall that allows for shifting conditions, and the section really combines this idea of a building inside a building, a space within a space, a kind of refined, curated space for art, and then this more raw, exposed architecture, which is really conceived of as an extension of the urban. And this is the space now under construction. That's me. And there's the kind of beginnings of that long wall, kind of canopy shooting through the space, and all the kind of nests and paraphernalia of the construction work going on. It's actually a little farther along at this point. Final 2 projects, quickly. Another project that works with nesting is a project that we won a competition for in Telluride, Colorado. The project worked with this really kind of spectacular existing condition. It's a warehouse, transfer warehouse that was constructed, again, before the turn of the century, and went through a whole series of transformations from a gas station to a storage warehouse, and currently exists as a kind of empty shell within the middle of the arts district in the city, and is utilized by something called the Telluride's Art Center for events, for parties, for gatherings, and has this really kind of wonderful quality of an existing urban ruin, where you go, again, from an outside to what should be an inside, and find yourself, again, on the outside. And we were asked to basically use this as a site for a new art center. And again, a kind of dilemma was presented, which is how do we create the level of control that we need for art without canceling out what's really kind of wonderful about the space, which is that it has this kind of fantastic quality of an urban ruin. And these are just early sketches looking at this idea, again, of nesting a new figure within the old walls. We wanted to expose and reveal these old existing historic walls, and then really treat them as a kind of primary envelope within which a secondary envelope would be inserted. So we would reinforce and kind of structurally augment the walls, and then use the space in between the new building and the old building as a thermal buffer that would allow for mitigation of temperature and humidity extremes. And then the old stone walls would be under sort of built by a new concrete foundation that would allow for the incorporation of program, a performance hall, and a kind of broadcast space. Then into that existing stone wall shell would be a new timber figure, which would house the new spaces of exhibition and kind of public occupation. So that's a view of the building. Again, looking through those existing historical walls, there's only a kind of hint of that new timber figure starting to kind of presence itself at the kind of upper frame, and you're looking through the old empty frames of windows into this new condition. A courtyard between the two structures is intended to maintain the sense of an outside. Maintain the sense of an outside, and in fact, the idea would be that the skylight would be retractable so that during clement weather you could open the space up, or you could pull back a folding screen wall so this could become an extension of the museum. When you're in that new building, you would be reframed towards views of the old walls, so cutouts and holes within the new architecture would reveal the old architecture, and then as you circulate through the space from upstairs to downstairs, you would be actually moving between the interstitial zone of the new timber figure and the old historic masonry walls, kind of exploiting these gaps as spaces for new staircases, moving to the lower level where there would be an exhibition and performance space, then back up towards the skylight, which would cap the gap between the existing and new walls, leading you to the upper level galleries, with views back towards the city, out through a series of calibrated apertures, a new climate-controlled exhibition space within, and then terminating again a roof deck, which would allow for 360-degree views of the Box Canyon that makes Telluride so spectacular. This was the model that we used to win the competition, which we had to transfer to Colorado from New York. The model arrived completely destroyed, so all of our work on that case kind of went, you can sort of see the damage to it here. But we used the case as its own display stand. The model could open up to deploy and kind of demonstrate the interior, and then kind of lock up for easy transportation and shipping from site to site. So finally, not really a category, but just an acknowledgement that most buildings are in fact hybrids of all these sectional types. There are very few pure examples of buildings, but in fact all of the buildings that we admire and I think are kind of fascinated by tend to be hybrids of many different forms of sectional operation. And in fact for us, these categories of section are not really meaningful in and of themselves. They're really just a way of opening up a discourse about architecture as sectional and how section can actually be used as a projective tool. So last project, just briefly to talk about, is a kind of hybrid. In fact, all of the projects I've shown are hybrids. But in this case, it's a renovation of a 1950s building that was originally done by Perkins and Will on the campus of Cornell University. It's part of their engineering quad. And you can see here the building in its original form, at the time state-of-the-art, but extremely thermally problematic from a contemporary point of view. Thin window walls, single glazing, very little kind of insulation on the building, and we were asked to transform it both to accommodate a series of state-of-the-art laboratories, but also to improve its thermal performance to a high level to become a sort of super performing building from an environmental standpoint. But the building in section was really a series of stacked floor plates, right? So it's everything that we've been talking about, just one of these floors above the other. And so what we did was to combine two typologies. One was obviously the operation of holes, so just cutting new openings through the existing floor plates to create visual and circulational linkages. And the other was an operation of horizontal shear, where we would extrude floor plates out of the building and add onto them to create kind of new cantilevered public and social spaces. That's the original condition of the building, that's the new building. So you can see how the corners extended and built onto to create this new three-dimensional extrusion. Those become lounge spaces on the interior of the building, and then they shelter the entryway that connects to the kind of campus landscape below. That links then to an interior staircase that you see here, which links to the upper levels of the building, which we created by excavating out the existing floor slabs, which you'll see in a moment. Those are those cantilevered lounge spaces from the interior, which allow for views into the adjacent gorges and kind of a landscape of the campus quad beyond. Those are the corridors as we found them, kind of your conventional institutional corridors with very little connection, certainly in section no connection to other spaces. So we both stripped them out, kind of denuded the original concrete architecture, and then we kind of opened up these large perforations to accommodate new publicly scaled circulatory spaces and visual linkages, so a new public square that leads up from the entry I showed a moment ago into the upper levels of the building, creating a kind of a horizontal visual extension to the landscape through a large-scale curtain wall, and then linking to a kind of upstairs zone where the corridors became not only spaces of circulation and movement, but also of collectivity, of gathering, of exchange among the students. Walls become places to sit, kind of temporarily, to exhibit conditions, and the ceilings, rather than dropped acoustical tile, we developed a series of custom formed aluminum panels that would allow for access to mechanical systems while creating a kind of directional effect that elongated or intensified the visual extrusion of the hallways, visual gaps that would create links between labs at the lower level and then public lounge and circulatory spaces at the upper level. And then on the exterior of the building, we completely stripped the old building down to the core and floor plates and then reclad it in a custom skin of thermal insulated glazing panels and custom terracotta panels. These panels actually act in a couple of ways. They provide a new insulating layer. It's about a 14-inch thick wall section. And the windows are distributed to do a couple of things. One is to optimize the distribution of light, the kind of angled condition of the beveled window frames, bounce light deeper into the space, and their kind of concatenation, their sort of rhythm over the facade allows for multiple reconfigurations of the space to occur without kind of closing down the flexibility of the program. Again, another large-scale perforation, creating a vertical stair at the front of the building, linking a new set of public spaces at the edge, opening up the corridors and then nesting new lab spaces within those corridors to create links to daylight and view while preserving the openness of the corridor as a kind of a single loaded condition. Secondary views of some of those labs and study spaces again, and then back to the exterior of the building. The building recently received LEED Platinum certification and is actually the highest performing building on Cornell's campus in terms of environmental effect, which is particularly challenging given it's a laboratory building. So finally, just to wrap up, just a brief kind of talk about the manual of section book itself. This is just a mapping of all the people. Many people worked on this project over about 4 years in the office. So the drawings are really a group effort, like everything in architecture, to generate a kind of wide range of possible work. The drawings were done through archival research. So, for example, in the example of Buckminster Fuller's Montreal Expo Dome, we actually interviewed and accessed the drawings of Buckminster Fuller's collaborator, Shoji Sado, who worked on the project. We translated those documents into three-dimensional digital models, which we then cut and then manipulated extensively in Photoshop and Illustrator through an iterative process to get to the final document. The drawings are really intended as an instructive tool. We're all teachers of architecture, and for us this was really the book that we wanted our students to have so that they could begin to really understand what we think is a kind of under-tapped resource architecturally. The idea about the section as not only a kind of documentary or retrospective tool, but actually as a generative device. And just to show where it's not all so serious, we also developed a manual section coloring book that we were showing with some of our children, kind of doing particular kind of colorful adaptations of various projects, and then shamelessly ending on the photograph of a cute child rather than a long theoretical discourse. So thank you.